wake me up to another good morning, time to go.
Are you ready to explore God's wild and wonderful world? Welcome to the Nat Theo podcast. I'm your host, Erin Lynham. I'm a certified master naturalist, Bible teacher, and author, and I am so excited to dive into God's written word, the Bible, and His created world with you. Have you ever found a strange creature in the water? When I was a young girl, I grew up near some woods and a pond, and my brother and sister and friends and I spent so many days exploring those woods and the pond. We would run and bike down the trails and find turtles in the water. But turtles are not the only creatures that we discovered in the pond. One day, we found small, worm-like creatures clinging to sticks near the pond's edge in the water. We thought perhaps it was a strange kind of fish. We happened to have brought a bucket with us, because that's always a good idea when you visit a pond. And we collected as many of those wriggling creatures as we could. And then we returned home to eagerly show our parents the unique fish that we had caught. Well, my dad started laughing so loudly because we had come home with a bucket full of leeches. Now, the creature we are learning about today is not a leech. We will need to save that for another lesson. But I want to share with you another story from a couple of years ago when my kids and I discovered another unique creature in a small pond, and we had no idea what it was. Here's our trail map.
Are you ready?
We are going to learn what is a vernal pond and what is a fairy shrimp. We will discover where fairy shrimp come from and how did God design fairy shrimp to thrive through rest. And finally, how can we wait and rest well? Before we hit the trail, let's thank our sponsor who made this lesson possible. Embark on an adventure during the Family Adventure Days at the Creation Museum. Explore incredible hands-on exhibits, wildlife encounters, and live presentations. The Family Adventure Days are happening every Monday, April through May 19th. Parents receive a free drink tumbler and kids a free treat, along with free interactive guidebooks, scavenger hunt booklets, and 4D theater shows along with live presentations. My family will never forget our time at the Creation Museum, and the Family Adventure Days are a perfect way for your family to experience this incredible adventure into God's wild and wonderful world. Visit creationmuseum.org/family-days to secure your tickets now or learn more and register at the link in our show notes. All right, here is today's trivia question. How many legs does a fairy shrimp have? Take a guess and we will find out at the end of our lesson. And Nat Theo Club members, be sure to click over after listening to the bonus video for this lesson, where we will discover how fairy shrimp do the backstroke and how their eggs can fly, perhaps even into outer space. You can find that bonus video in the show notes or in your Nat Theo Club dashboard. Listeners, if you want access to that video along with all our bonus videos, full lesson and activity guides, and nature devotions, you can join the Nat Theo Club at the link in our show notes or at erinlynham.com/club. A couple of summers ago, my family and I were exploring in the Rocky Mountains. We were climbing over big boulders, these massive rocks, and seeing what we could find. We noticed that way on top of the boulders, there were tiny ponds. These ponds were not like the pond that I grew up by, with lots of grass and aquatic plants and a murky, muddy bottom. Instead, these little ponds were inside the rocks themselves. The big boulder rocks had depressions, It almost looked like a big giant had come along and pressed his thumb into the boulders like they were Play-Doh. Of course, that's not what happened, but that's what it looked like. The depressions in the rocks had filled with rainwater, creating tiny ponds. Before long, my kids called over to me excitedly. They said, "Hey, Mom, come here. Look what we found." So I jumped over the rocks to go see what they had discovered. My sons were laying on their bellies on the boulders and staring into one of the little ponds. So I got down next to them and laid on my belly and looked closely into the water. After a moment, I noticed that there were tiny, wriggling creatures all throughout the water. As we watched them, we counted at least 5 different creatures using the pond as their home. I had never expected to find so much life in a kind of puddle-like pond up on top of a bunch of rocks in the mountains. What we discovered that day is called a vernal pond. A vernal pond is a seasonal pond. This means it is temporary. It is not always there. Instead, it forms when rainwater fills an area to create a pond during wet seasons. Because of their temporary nature, or the fact that these ponds are not always there, they create a very unique mini habitat. A habitat is where something living makes its home. It's an area that provides what the living thing needs to survive, including food, water, shelter, and a mate. Something unique about vernal ponds is that they do not have fish. A vernal pond is not a good habitat for a fish because it dries out. But that means it is a great habitat for creatures that fish would normally eat because they don't need to worry about being gobbled up by a trout. So if fish don't live in vernal ponds, what does? Vernal ponds often have amphibians, such as frogs and salamanders, and they also are home to special invertebrates. But what are invertebrates? Invertebrates are creatures that do not have a backbone or a bony skeleton. Can you think of any creature that does not have a backbone or bony skeleton? I'm going to play music for a few moments. As I do, see if you can think of animals that might be invertebrates without a backbone. Okay, do you have some invertebrates in mind? Now, God designed many invertebrates, but here are some examples. Invertebrates include jellyfish, worms, insects, spiders, crabs, shrimp, squid, octopus, snails, and clams. You may have guessed some different creatures. Ask for permission and help to look up whether or not the animal you thought of is indeed an invertebrate. Now, you are not going to find a giant squid or jellyfish in a vernal pond. The invertebrates that we listed are creatures found throughout God's wild and wonderful world. But what about in the vernal pond? Invertebrates that you might find in a seasonal vernal pond include insects and shrimp.
What?
Yes, that's right, shrimp. That day, exploring the boulders up in the mountains with my kids, we had found a unique animal with a fun name, the fairy shrimp. Until that point, I had no idea that we have shrimp in Colorado. But there I was, lying on my belly on a boulder with a magnifying glass hovering over the surface of the water and staring at a tiny shrimp. In fact, there were many of them swimming all over the vernal pond. Now, these were not like the shrimp that I had seen in aquariums that skitter across the sand or up on rocks, feeling everything with their antenna. These shrimp in the vernal pond looked very different. They were quite small, only a 1/2 inch to 1 inch long. Some of them had strangely shaped heads that looked like they had itty bitty elephant trunks on them. And some had tiny eggs in a see-through sac near their tail. I was filled with awe and wonder at this creature. I had never seen anything like it, and it was so much fun to discover it way up in the mountains in a little pool of water on the boulders. It just goes to show us where curiosity and wonder can lead. So what exactly is a fairy shrimp? They are small, see-through crustaceans that live in fresh water. In fact, they only live in vernal ponds. Since they are crustaceans, they are in the same category of animal as shrimp and crabs and lobster. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever heard of a sea monkey? When I was a kid, we raised sea monkeys. They began as tiny eggs, and we watched them hatch in their plastic container into little wriggling creatures. Sea monkeys are a type of brine shrimp, and the fairy shrimp that we are learning about today are very similar to brine shrimp, or a type of sea monkey. Now, you might be asking a question that I was curious about as my kids and I stared into that vernal pond watching the fairy shrimp. How did they get there? If the pond comes and goes with the seasons, where do these shrimp come from? Especially when they're found way up high in the mountains. Well, that question has a fascinating answer. Let's now look at where fairy shrimp come from. Fairy shrimp hatch from eggs. Have you ever heard the puzzling question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? We could ask the same about fairy shrimp. Which came first, the fairy shrimp or its eggs? Personally, I believe the fairy shrimp came first, and that God created it when He designed all of the water creatures on day 5 of creation. In Genesis 1:20, God said, "Let the water be filled with living things." God filled the oceans and seas and rivers and ponds with incredible living creatures, including creating the fairy shrimp. God made the water creatures able to produce more of their kind to fill the earth, and that includes fairy shrimp, because God wants the earth to be full of His wonderful creatures. So fairy shrimp lay eggs, which hatch into more fairy shrimp. And the eggs of fairy shrimp are very amazing. Remember that the vernal ponds are temporary. They dry up. And so fairy shrimp eggs have to be able to be both wet and dry. They have to survive many very hard conditions. And this is where we come to our question about rest. How did God design the fairy shrimp to thrive or live well through rest? God designed fairy shrimp as a wonderful example of resting and waiting. Those tiny eggs that the fairy shrimp mama lays, they can remain dormant for years. But what is that word dormant? Dormant means that something is not active or growing, but it could become active and keep growing in the future. It's kind of like suspended animation or a pause from regular life and activities. When a creature is dormant, it is in deep rest. This is an important part of the fairy shrimp's life cycle. Here's a glimpse at where new fairy shrimp come from. A fairy shrimp mama lays her eggs in the vernal pond, and then that fairy shrimp mama passes away. The pond might dry up. Her eggs are still in the depression where the pond used to be, and now they are dried up. Those eggs can survive in this new, dry environment. They can even survive in freezing temperatures. Then, once the rainy season comes again, and rain fills up the depression and it becomes a vernal pond again, the eggs hatch into a new generation of fairy shrimp, and the cycle continues. So God designed fairy shrimp eggs to remain dormant through harsh conditions. Where I live in Colorado, Those harsh conditions can include drought or very hot and dry seasons with very little water. So what happens to the fairy shrimp eggs when no rain comes and there are no vernal ponds for them to hatch into? Well, they keep waiting. Fairy shrimp eggs can remain dormant, waiting for the right conditions for years, even tens of years. Some scientists believe they can remain dormant for centuries or hundreds of years. That is a long time to wait. But as soon as the water returns and the temperatures are right, those eggs hatch and burst into life with new baby fairy shrimp. When God created creatures to reproduce and fill the earth and make more of their own kind, He knew about every challenge that they might face, including the fairy shrimp, and He designed them to meet those challenges. It can be difficult to wait for things, can't it? Think of those tiny fairy shrimp eggs in a dried up boulder way up high in the mountains, waiting to hatch. Now, of course, the tiny fairy shrimp inside those eggs, they're not thinking about waiting. They are deep at rest. But this is a beautiful picture of how God sometimes calls us to seasons of waiting, and as we wait, to rest in Him. You see, the tiny fairy shrimp has no control over when the water comes or what temperature it is. It cannot dial up the thermostat or make the clouds gather to rain down water into the depression to create the vernal pond. Instead, it has to wait. In a similar way, we don't have control over many of the things around us. We have to wait for God to arrange the circumstances. This makes me think of a very special word in the Bible. It is the word kavah. Can you say that? Kavah. This is a Hebrew word, and one place that we find it in the Bible is in Isaiah 40:31, which says, "Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength." Now, this verse might get a little bit confusing if you read it in a different Bible translation. In the ESV translation, which I use for Bible study, the same verse says this: "They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength." Did you catch the difference? Here, let's play a game of Spot the Difference. I will read both translations of Isaiah 40:31 again and see if you can spot the difference. The NIV says, "Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength." The ESV says, "They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength." Did you spot the difference? One translation says, "Those who hope in the Lord," while the other translation says, "Those who wait in the Lord." Hope and wait seem pretty different, don't they? In fact, I've even heard followers of God argue about this verse and what it means, which is never what God means for us to do. God wants us to rightly understand and use His word. In this case, we can do that by going back to the original meaning of the word in the Hebrew language. That is where this Hebrew word kavah comes in. Kavah is the word translated in these verses as hope and wait. And the beautiful thing about this word is that it means to both hope and wait at the same time. It is its own word that we don't really have a good word for in English. It means to wait with great expectation, to look forward to something while we wait. Think about the fairy shrimp eggs. They are waiting for the right conditions. And likewise, we can kavah. We can wait with great expectation, looking forward to all that God will do according to His promises. So how can we wait and rest like a fairy shrimp egg? Instead of trying to arrange and control the circumstances around us, we can trust that God is at work in the details of our lives. Now, of course, God wants us to be faithful with the opportunities and the work that He gives us. And as we show up and grow in faith, we can trust Him to take care of the things that are outside of our control. Remember, they who wait for and hope in the Lord shall renew their strength. All right, it's time for today's listener question. Today's listener question is made possible by the Kids Answers magazine by Answers in Genesis. Kids, if you are excited about God's wild and wonderful world, this magazine is perfect for you. Parents and grandparents, give the gift of faith-filled learning with the Kids Answers magazine. This award-winning magazine features exciting stories, creature features, and engaging activities. The Kids Answers magazine reconnects the dots between creation and creator in beautiful and fun ways that will inspire your child in their faith and in nature study. Every subscription comes with a free gift. Visit getanswers.org/kids to subscribe or gift a subscription today. Learn more and subscribe at the link in our show notes. Here is our listener question.
Hello, my name is Henry. Me and my brother George, we both want to know how big can spiders grow and what is the biggest kind of spider in the world?
This is a great question, Henry and George. How big do spiders grow? And what is the biggest kind of spider in the world? I have seen some pretty big spiders. A common one that we have here in Colorado is the fuzzy wolf spider. Wolf spiders are one of the largest spiders that we have in Colorado, and they can sometimes be mistaken for a tarantula because they're so big and fuzzy. But these spiders do not grow very large, only to about 3 inches, including their legs, or about the length of a crayon. So do spiders get much larger than that? In fact, they do, especially in South America and Southeast Asia, where the largest species of spiders live. Let's look first at the runner-up. It's called, are you ready for this? The Goliath bird eater. It can have a leg span, so its entire body's length of 11 inches or 28 centimeters. That's almost a foot long. So this spider is about the size of a dinner plate. The Goliath bird eater lives in the rainforests of South America. And despite its name, it does not normally eat birds. It's more likely to snack on amphibians, insects, and worms. But the first prize winner for largest spider goes to the giant huntsman spider in Southeast Asia, which has a leg span of 1 foot or 30 centimeters. Thanks for your great question, Henry and George. Stay curious about God's wild and wonderful world. And listeners, if you are curious about something in nature, you can send in your question at erinlynham.com/ask or at the link in our show notes. And Nat Theo Club members, remember after this lesson to click over to the bonus video and learn how fairy shrimp do the backstroke and how their eggs can fly, perhaps even into outer space. You can access that bonus video in the show notes. All right, it's time to answer our trivia question. How many legs does a fairy shrimp have? A fairy shrimp can be very small, about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch long, or around the size of a paperclip. And yet it has 11 pairs of legs. Each pair, of course, has 2 legs, one on each side. So what is 11 times 2? 22. Little fairy shrimp have 22 legs. It's a good thing they do not need to wear shoes because that could get expensive. All right, now it's your turn to explore. Go out and find a vernal pond. With help or permission, you can research online where they can be located near you, or go out exploring and looking for small ponds. They could be in rocks, like the ones that my family found, or in wetlands, or close to larger ponds and water ecosystems. Look for a small pond that has living creatures and plants in it, but no fish. See what tiny creatures you can spot wriggling around in the water. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this lesson on fairy shrimp, please take a moment to send it to a friend. And subscribe, rate, and review Nat Theo wherever you listen. Until next time, keep exploring God's wild and wonderful world.